I'm speaking with the Speaker of the Missouri House, Todd Richardson of Poplar Bluff, from his law office in Poplar Bluff. Speaker, thanks for joining me for a few minutes.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing well, and this is another House Communications Google Hangout. We're going to be previewing the 2017 legislative session and a number of things that you've been spending a lot of time on recently that'll be priorities for you and for your caucus. Let's start with issues including labor reform. We've known you and I have talked several times about that being a priority. Is that something you're going to kind of hit the ground with? Will that be one of the things we see right out of the gate in January?
Yeah, I think we're going to start in January. We're going to hit the ground running when the legislature reconvenes on the 4th of January. But we want to have an aggressive approach early in session and really follow through on some of the things that we think the voters were talking about when they spoke in November. And labor reform is going to be a part of that. You know, as we look at economic growth here in Missouri and we look at what some of our competitors are doing, it's clear that it's time for Missouri to embrace the kind of 21st century labor policies that other states have embraced. So I anticipate that we'll take action early on those issues. We obviously want to get them right, but we're going to move them early in session.
What kind of things are we talking about? I assume right to work and prevailing wage legislation. Is there anything else?
Well, I think right to work for sure. And then, as you know, the House spent a significant amount of time working on paycheck protection. Last year, I anticipate we'll also take a look at project labor agreements and how they can sometimes stifle our economy and keep contractors from being able to compete for business. So those are the range of issues that I think we'll take a look at it as it relates to the labor space.
What about legal reform? There were a couple that moved through the session last year but didn't make it to the finish line. Will you start with those?
Yeah, we want to improve the overall legal environment here in Missouri, and you know there are a number of nonpartisan groups that have looked at the legal environment here in Missouri, and it's consistently given a very poor rating. And so we want to start with two issues that we looked at and spent a lot of time on last year. One was the expert witness reform, and the other was an issue called collateral source. So I anticipate we'll start with both of those when we get back in January.
With those and with the labor reform issues, the assumption for those outside this building looking in is, well, now you have not only the Republican supermajorities in both chambers, you have a Republican governor. There are some saying that we might see, for example, a right-to-work bill passed out of the House in the first week of the session. How quickly do you anticipate being able to move on these issues, and are these all going to be slam dunks, as a lot of people predict?
Well, I don't know that anything in the legislative process is ever a slam dunk, but we'll visit some more about what the timing is going to be of some of those issues, and we're going to have a caucus meeting in about a week. So we'll discuss some of the timing. But what we want to do, the people of Missouri expect that we're going to get to work when the session convenes, and so I don't want us to have a 2 or 3 week period where we're taking time to get organized. We're going to do the work now through the first of the year to be organized and ready to do substantive work as soon as we get back.
Let's talk about education reform. That has been a tougher issue to tackle in recent years, but it's one that you want to spend some time on again?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think every Missouri child ought to have the opportunity to get a world-class education. That'll be true no matter what their zip code is, where they live, whether that's in rural Missouri or that's in St. Louis or Kansas City. And so what we want to do is look at some ways that we think our policy can improve to make sure that each child is guaranteed that world-class education. All of these issues we've been talking about, whether it's labor reform or tort reform or education reform, are related to trying to get Missouri into a better place economically, where our economy is growing at a faster rate than it's growing today, where we're seeing wage growth across the board. And if we do that, it'll give Missourians the opportunity to build a better life for themselves than they have today. And ultimately, that's our goal, is to create the kind of environment where we have a strong, a vibrant, a dynamic economy that allows upward mobility. And so all of these changes we're talking about fit in that same space.
What do you think Missouri needs in the way of education reform?
Mike, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think your question was, what do you think Missouri needs in the way of education reform? And I think,
right,
you know, there are a range of options we've looked at, and charter schools have had an excellent record of success in some parts of our state. I think we want to expand and make those opportunities continue to be available in those places. But we're going to look at policies that help improve student achievement and how students are performing across the board. And in a lot of cases, that's going to be working with our partners in the public school system, and in some places, it's going to be looking at other opportunities. So that's an issue that I anticipate we'll spend a good deal of time on. We've identified a task force of members in the House that's going to start digging in to those issues specifically, and hopefully come to us with some pretty strong recommendations on what we ought to do.
All right, let's talk a little bit about ethics reform with just a few minutes left. And you said at the end of the 2016 session that the gift ban legislation that fell short of the finish line last year could be your first or one of your first bills to hit the floor in the House this in 2017. Is that still maybe the priority when it comes to ethics reform?
It absolutely is, and Representative Justin Alferman has, I know, already pre-filed that legislation, and so that's a bill that I will refer to committee as we did last year on the very first day of session, and we want to get it moving very early in the process. You know, I was proud last year that we were able to take some substantive, meaningful steps forward on ethics reform, but I don't think anybody thinks that job is complete. We want the environment in Jefferson City to be better than it is today, and that's going to be an ongoing process. This year, that's going to start with work on the gift ban.
What do you anticipate revisiting? There are some who have suggested that the revolving door, we might see a shorter or a longer, rather, time period on that. Do you plan to look at that again? Do you see any other ethics issues that need to be dealt with?
We pushed for a longer ban on the revolving door last year, and so we're certainly going to be open to expanding that from where it is today. But I think our priority out of the box is going to be to focus on lobbyist gifts and to put that gift ban in place.
All right. I know another issue you've been talking about a lot in these last couple of months leading up to the session has been that of regulations, the regulatory environment in Missouri, and some of that deals with Uber and TNC. There's also a Sunrise bill that's been offered in the last few years. So you've got several balls in the air in that area.
Yeah, we want to take this notion of cutting red tape and removing the regulatory barriers for business out of the campaign space and into the practical legislative space. We actually want to get something done to make the regulatory burden smaller on Missourians and Missouri businesses. And so that's going to take a couple of different forms. Obviously, one of the things that we worked on last year was a statewide regulatory framework for transportation network companies. Companies like Uber and Lyft that provide ride-sharing services. That's going to continue to be a priority for the House. We want Missouri to be a state where we're embracing an innovation economy, but it's also going to take the form of a push for what we are calling the Sunrise Act, which at its core requires there to be an analysis on the front end before new regulations or new licensing requirements are put in place for employment. We want to do an analysis on the front end to make sure that those regulations are actually needed, and if they're not, Missouri doesn't need to be imposing them. So that's where we're going to start in the regulatory space, and then we want to take a more comprehensive look overall at what our licensing requirements are here in Missouri. And we want, obviously, to protect public safety and make sure that people are qualified to do the jobs they're doing. But we also don't want that licensing requirement to present an unnecessary barrier to employment. And this is something that this legislature has been talking about for a long time, and I anticipate we'll see a big push to get something done there this year.
And I think maybe it's worth noting that we're talking about things that we mentioned, obviously Uber and Lyft, but we're talking about regulations that affect Missourians at many, many different levels throughout the state. An example that's come up in recent years has been hair braiding and regulations of that, interior decorators. I think this is going to affect a broad section of Missourians.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you think about the notion of somebody having to go get literally hundreds of hours of training before the state will allow them to do a little hair braiding on the side because they want to earn some extra income. It's just something that doesn't make sense when you explain it to most Missourians. So we want to figure out a way to responsibly reduce and remove those regulatory and licensing burdens in the hopes that it will allow people a better opportunity to start a small business or to earn a little extra income.
Could this go both directions? As you're looking at regulations, do you envision saying, for example, electricians or some area where maybe there needs to be more regulation than what there is?
Well, I'm not aware of a whole lot of people clamoring for more regulation in any area. But obviously there are areas where the state does have a role in making sure people are qualified to do the jobs that they're doing, whether it's somebody like an electrician or a doctor or a nurse. And we're obviously not talking about removing all of the requirements in those areas. But there are some areas and some particular places of employment where we do think the state is being overly aggressive in its licensing and regulatory environment. And those are the areas that we're going to look.
I had another conversation with the budget chairman, Scott Fitzpatrick, just a couple of weeks ago, and something that he has talked about several times in the last few months, especially since being named budget chairman, is Medicaid and how much of Missouri's budget is going into that. And other budget directors, both in the House and Senate, have talked about this. You and I have discussed before Medicaid reform, if only to try and lessen the impact on Missouri's budget. How do you plan to approach that this year?
Well, there's no question that Medicaid continues to be a significant drain on the budget, and particularly it's consuming most of the growth that we've had in the economy. I point out to people all the time, Medicaid spending is up 27% over the last 7 years, at a time when the state's revenue is only growing at an average of about 4.5%. So the facts show this: if we are going to hope to continue to invest in other priorities of the state, whether that be education or transportation or economic development, we're going to have to get a handle on what the long-term cost trajectory of Medicaid is. Because if we don't, it's going to consume every bit of discretionary revenue that's in the budget. So we've done some things over the last couple of years to try to bend that cost curve, but those efforts need to continue. It's a budget imperative that they continue. Now, I think it's important to point out Medicaid is one of the few areas where you can get a true win-win, because the healthier people are and the better care you get them on the front end, the lower the cost is to care for them. So we want to find some ways to try to move people more into primary care to get them the help they need on the front end, so we don't have recurrent visits to the emergency room. The emergency room costs are a huge driver in Medicaid. So those are the types of things that we're going to look at, and I think Chairman Fitzpatrick's concerns about the growth in Medicaid are very well placed. I know it's an area that the Governor-elect is interested in looking at, and our colleagues in the Senate as well.
And let me ask you about that too, what your conversations with the governor-elect have been. Obviously, with what happened with the incident with his wife earlier this week, you had one conversation postponed there, but I'm sure you've talked to him about that. But what kind of conversations have you had with Governor-elect Greitens and with your counterparts in the Senate about these issues? And do you think the House and the Senate and the governor-elect are on the same page on a lot of these?
I think it's going to be an extraordinary partnership together. Our conversations have been very productive, and we've been engaged with his transition, and he's been engaged with the legislature, and the House and Senate continue to have some of the best communication between each other that I've seen in my time in the building. So I'm really optimistic that partnership is going to be a very strong one when we get underway in January, and I think that partnership is going to lead to productive results for the state.
All right. One last thing I want to ask you about while we've got just a little bit of time here, and that was a recent article in pitch.com about the Department of Corrections, and it outlined a number and presented what it said was backing information about a number of cases of harassment, most of them sexually based harassment of Department of Corrections employees by other employees, and how that was handled. And I know that has raised concern with you and others in this building. Is that something that you anticipate looking into once we get into the session?
Absolutely. The things that have been reported coming out of the Department of Corrections are unacceptable. They're unacceptable for our state. They ought to be unacceptable in any workplace environment. And, you know, they're doubly concerning here in Missouri because it's leading to a huge budget impact. The cost of the state to have to settle these claims has been significant. So we're going to undertake a very thorough review of what's going on at the Department of Corrections that will involve our budget committees, but it's also going to involve our policy committees. So we can get to the bottom of what's going on, and most importantly, how do we make the environment there better than it is today? Because I don't think anybody can look at those stories and say this is acceptable, or this is the way that Missouri ought to be doing business.
So I assume we'll hear over the next few weeks then how you're going to proceed with that.
You will, yeah.
All right. House Speaker Todd Richardson of Poplar Bluff has been our guest on this House Communications Hangout. Speaker, thank you very much for your time.
Mike, thanks. Enjoyed it.